Hello and welcome to a brand new miniature painting video series from Heroes Infinite. Today we're going to be painting NKIRUKA, Voice of the Ancestors, and she's from the Mortenburg Chronicles, the Hive of the wargames Termigants. This release is currently available at a super low price, so head on over to heroesinfinite.com and treat yourself to a truly wonderful miniature experience. Right, so painting the skin on this lady, we're obviously trying to do a very dark brown African skin. So the base coat I've used here is Burnt Umber and King Purple from AK Interactive. Now, I love having that bit of purple in for shadowy tones anyway with a lot of things. And when we are painting brown skin, we've got to sort of avoid the normal sort of yellowy, orangey hues that we get in Caucasian skin. We want to use orange as the main highlight here with very little white. That's what I found works best for me. So we're going to highlight this up by adding in medium rust from AK Interact. We're blending in that first highlight now. So I've got an in-between colour here of the two mixes I've had, which is the Burnt Umber and King Purple, and the Burnt Umber with medium rust. So I literally mix up an in-between colour and I'm just feathering over the joint between the two colours. So more medium rust is added to the previous mix we had here, and we're just picking out smaller and smaller spots and pushing the highlights up to the higher points and the parts that are looking up towards the sky. Because we always imagine that the light is coming from above when we're painting something like this. So the highlights are going to very much sort of catch on the top of areas. And here we've got the sort of final highlight, which is almost pure medium rust now. And as you can see, I'm adding tiny little highlights just to the very top areas and trying to really just sort of pick those out. The highlight should also be brighter near the top of the model. So here we're going to be glazing all this to try and homogenize all these colors. And this is more of a sort of medium rust sort of tone, but it's thinned down, so it's very, very watery. And I just glaze over and over, mainly where all the highlight areas are. So onto the blue cloth now, and I'm using a mix of the Burnt Umber, medium blue, and a little bit of King Purple here, just to do the base coat over the main thing. I was trying to keep the brown tone somewhere in this cloth as well, because you know a lot of this majority is based on brown tones. So as you can see here, I've added some medium blue into that mix now to lighten it up. And we're just pushing towards the top highlights. We want this to be a fairly bright blue, but I want that sort of browner tone to show in the shadows. So as we progress here, we just add more and more of the medium blue. So I've added more of that medium blue here and a little bit of Ducat blue, which is quite a light whitish blue. As you can see, it starts to turn quite sort of whitish in some of the tones, and this becomes harder and harder to blend and to get a smooth transition when we have these white colors added to mixes, as you've probably seen yourself. So more Ducat blue is added now, and it's getting very, very light. It may not look it on the palette, but when you see it on the model, you would sort of think that the tips of those highlights are white, but they're actually still a very sort of medium lightish blue. Now, which makes quite a stark effect when we do it. So here I end up mixing a glaze up of the previous mix with a little bit more of the medium blue in. And like the skin, I'm just going over and over, and this mix is probably 4 to 6 parts water to 1 part paint. It really is, it just looks like dirty water when it's on the brush and on the model. It does very little, but over several layers it builds up to smoothing out the transition, and it really homogenizes all the colors over the element that you've painted. Right, we're on to painting the robe now. And for this, I took an initial mix of mud brown here. And I'm just putting on a base coat, but as you can see, I leave a lot of the shadow areas unpainted. So I want them to stay that little bit of a darker tone. So here what I've done is I've taken that mud brown and I've added a little bit of the red skin shadow into it, and I'm feathering out the edges of the initial layer and the shadow zone, and I'm just trying to sort of make a gradient between the two so there's not too sharp a line between the very dark priming, which is virtually black, and the mud brown. So here I mix up a thinner mix of the red skin shadow, and what I'm doing here is I'm sort of glazing in the shadowy areas. So I'm pushing that red skin shadow really sort of up into the shadow areas, but I'm sort of pushing it from the sort of mid-tone into the shadow. So this is adding more smoothing. So for the zebra stripes, or whatever they would be here, I'm just using pure black, and I've thinned it down quite a bit here, so it's going to take a few coats going over and over, but it's important to keep the paint thinner when you're trying to paint free hands and shapes and details. It gives you much better control. Right, on to painting the staff. So I'm going to do this in sections, but it's all within the one section. So the first layers on the staff, the main half of the shaft part of the staff, is black and blood red. And I get a nice good even coat all the way over this, as I want this to be a darkish red. So we've added a lot of blood red into this now, and we're building up that quite a sort of maroon type red colour. Just painting on the bits that stand out, the little upstanding bits. We add more and more blood red here, and the last stage is I've added cadmium red, which is it's an orangey tone. It's not really a red, it's an orange. And we're just getting the joint bits of these things, the little bits that stick out. For the face of the staff, I wanted to paint this a sort of brassy sort of colour here. So I'd already base coated it at the same time as I did the staff in the same colour. So I'm using dark brown here as the main colour. So we want this a sort of NMM, but not overly bright. Now, to do the NMM effect, I'm painting very small, sharp areas over the face. And to do this, I'm just progressively adding more and more buff to this mix. This is the first highlight stage here. And as you can see, I'm just picking out the very up-facing and sharp bits of this face. There won't be as much highlighting on the bottom of the face because that is facing down and away from the light source. So when I get to the final highlight here, I'm really adding it just to the very top parts of the face and the little beardy part on the staff, which makes the effect look really good. For the red ropes, I've base coated these in a brilliant colour from AK, which is red skin shadow. This is a really, really cool sort of reddish brown colour, and it's a good base coat for a lot of things, and I use it quite a lot. So we're just trying to get a nice even coverage over the whole surface here. Now we want these ropes to be a sort of reddish tone, so I'm using brick red here, and I've added some brick red to the side of the palette there, and I've added a little bit of the red skin shadow in just to sort of bridge the colour between the two. And I'm painting all the little notches in the rope, all the little braided parts. So I go over all of this a couple of times to build up the opacity, and the final highlight here is pure brick red. I'm painting very much the top parts. And if you can see here, it's a bit like the face, that I'm painting the upper parts, which would be facing more with this final highlight, and not the pieces that are underneath the staff. I base coated the feathers with chocolate chipping from AK Interactive. And what you can see here is I'm putting on the first highlight where I've added brick red and a little tiny bit of buff to that mix to give us a sort of pinky brown colour. I just want something that's a little bit different here to work with these feathers. The final highlight is added with just buff added to the mix here. I'm trying to get them to stand out a bit, so I'm just painting the very tops of these feathers and a few of the little individual strands, but don't want to go too overboard with these. Now for the blue parts of the hanging bits and the cloth bit, I went here with a mix of really just ocean blue and a little bit of star blue, two colours that I really like from AK Interactive. And for the first, what I call the main sort of mid-tone, I'm going with pure star blue here. So we're doing quite a big jump here to make these stand out and look really quite cool. Because they're smaller bits of cloth than the cloth we painted earlier, the transitions can be a little bit higher and the jump can be a little bit more because the spacing between the colours is not so great. So for the final highlight, I've added pale yellow into the star blue, which I love. I love this combination of colours. It makes blues that little bit more of a turquoisey colour and not so stark as just adding white in. And this is something I use quite a lot when I'm painting blues. I prefer that turquoisey, yellowy tone in blues than just whites. And this comes out really nice on this effect. For the yellow parts, the base colour I used was Beast Brown with a little touch of volcanic yellow in the mix. Volcanic yellow is just such a vibrant yellow colour, and it works really well when you're painting yellows and golds. It makes a really good gold. So I've added more of the volcanic yellow in now, and we're just building up the highlights into the uppermost parts of each of these sections. And I just build this up. Yellow is very transparent, so you have to add quite a few layers to build up the opacity here. And the final highlight is pure volcanic yellow. And as you can see, I'm just touching the very tips of each little element, which makes them really stand out and protrude from the painting. So we're on to painting the gold parts of the staff. There's quite a few awkward bits here. And the first mix I add here is Beast Brown with a little tiny bit of golden brown in it. And I'm painting most of these areas. They're already undercoated in this brownish tone. So I can just leave that darker tone in the areas that I want. So here we're coming in with pure golden brown, and we're painting the main, what I would call the mid-tones here, the main sections, and I'm blocking these in quite heavy. The paint is not diluted an awful lot because I want this colour to really show. So we're blocking these in quite heavy with a mind to knocking them back and blending them in just a second. So we're going to blend those in now with a mix of the golden brown and a little bit of the beast brown. So very much an in-between tone. And I'm just feathering the edge of the layer I've just put on with this mix. It's thinned down a little bit, but the secret is to not have very much on the brush. So you're just touching those edges and brushing in different ways to try and form a little graduation between, or gradient between the two tones. So we've come in now more with volcanic yellow, this brighter, more sort of golden yellow, and we're adding this in as the main highlight, where I'm trying to build those shine spots now to add those areas which are gonna really give us that sense of this being a metallic object, which it's going to fool the viewer into thinking these are bright and shiny spots. The last highlight here is done by adding pale yellow, which is a very sort of whitish yellow. It's a lot of white in it, so we get very high values with this color. So when I'm painting these in, it's just very much little dots, those shine spots we're creating with this color. The final step here is I've gone back to the volcanic yellow and I've mixed up a very thin down glaze here. And what I'm trying to do is to bring back that yellowy tone and add this very much a golden feel. You can see it on the base of the staff there quite a lot, how just adding this glaze does so much. So painting the tusks now. The first part is the bony parts. I did use chocolate and buff for this. So the first layer here is very much chocolate, where I went over all the bone areas and laid in the base colour. Now, once that was all down, I added in buff, which is probably my favourite colour for doing bones and tusks and horns. It really works so well for me. And here I'm just building up all the little highlights of all these little areas, the sticky out bits, the pointy bits, and importantly on the inside of these tusks here, there's some sort of like the bones sort of integrate with the tusk parts, which we want to paint a different colour. And here you can see I'm just picking those out and then trying to form the shapes of all these bones and little parts that are there. More buff is added and I'm just picking out those little tiny parts now to give them some definition. Now, when this is all done, I mixed up a glaze of it's sort of buff and a little bit of chocolate brown. And I just go over and over this quite a few times. And it just takes out the starkness of the white that's in the buff. And it smooths and blends it. So for the tusk parts here, I'm using grey blue with a little tiny little bit of black added into it. Probably a little bit of the chocolatey colour will show through here. So we want these tusks to be a little bit different. So we're giving them that grey blue colour. And I blend this colour in with a mix of the grey blue and a little bit of the chocolate here. And I push this colour towards the chocolatey colour of the previous mix we had. Now, to highlight this, I'm going back to buff now, and we're adding buff into the grey-blue tone, which makes a slightly different tone to what we used on the bones earlier. And it pushes it more towards that sort of whitish tone, which we want to pick out the highlight areas here. Now, to finish this off, I've mixed up a really thin glaze of the previous tone, and I just push this tone towards the sharpest areas. On to painting the hair. The base coat for the hair here was burnt umber, a little bit of the king purple and a little bit of black to make it a little bit darker. And I've gone over quite a few times with this, trying to get as good a layer as I can. And what I did, it still wasn't dark enough in the recesses, so I've actually mixed up a wash here of black and king purple. And I don't use washes very often, but on things like hair with lots of nooks and crannies, it can work really nicely. And I just go over this and make sure I get all of those deepest areas shaded. So for the main highlight on here, I've gone to graphite into my original mix, and I just go through here and I'm literally just picking out each little part of the hair of these look like dreadlocks, so I call them they're like rope, like little notches that I'm just going to paint the top surfaces of these. Now for the little red bangly bits on the hair, I wanted these to be quite a nice bright red. So I've got the main coat here is dirty red, which I'm going all over these and trying to get as good a coverage as I can so we get a nice base for this brighter red. And the final highlight on these was very simple. It's just blood red. And I'm just picking out each individual bangle in these, and each layer I'm painting on here, I'm progressively getting the layer smaller and smaller to leave a bright highlight. Right, we're on to painting the main gold of the character here. It's probably going to be very similar to what I did on the staff, but the base coat here is red skin shadow, and I'm having to go over all these little parts and make sure they've got a really nice covering. So for the first layer here, I've got a mix of beast brown and volcanic yellow. And it's sort of like more like a second shadow, this. I wouldn't say this is the mid-tone, because probably the mid-tone is more volcanic yellow. But I'm going over most of the parts here. I'm making sure there's that sort of orangey yellow tone that's going to show through quite a lot and act as a base for the more yellowy tone. Now we're coming in with more volcanic yellow added into the beastie brown. And I'm building this gold, I'm building the layers up a little bit more gradually, so I don't have to do as much blending in between each layer. So that's the sort of way of painting. If you make your jumps slightly less, you don't have such big graduations between each colour, or gradients rather. So here we've got to virtually pure volcanic yellow now, and you can see how much impact this colour has on the gold. This is where we really see that true golden colour, and this is what I would call more my main mid-tone here. So this is the colour that I want to show most of all when you look at this as a gold. So I'm painting, larger areas here with this colour. And for the final highlight here, I'm adding in pale yellow, which is my go-to colour for gold. Whichever type of gold I'm doing, I usually end up adding pale yellow as the final highlights. And again, it's added progressively to the volcanic yellow mix, getting brighter and brighter and getting those highlights smaller and smaller. And for the final step here, I've gone back to volcanic yellow and made up a glaze, which is very, very thin. This is sort of 5 to 6 parts water to 1 part paint. Very little shows, but I go over and over the surface, blending the colours with this glaze. So we're painting the headpiece now. The main colour I use here is cadmium red. Fantastic colour from AK Interactive, a really nice reddish orange. And then all I did here was I've got pure black here, and I've thinned this down a little bit, not as thin as I would if I was painting a freehand perhaps. And I'm just going to paint the sort of this animal hide sort of patterning all over this headpiece. Now, once that pattern's all in place, then I start adding yellow into the cadmium red. And I'm trying to carefully paint very small parts inside the cadmium red. And you'll notice here that I push the highlights more towards the center of the object. Now, there's a spine running there that's sort of at an angle. And as I add more of the yellow to the color, I build those highlights up more to the central area of the headpiece, which gives it a really nice effect and makes that centerpiece stand out as the focal point. The last part to paint on this wonderful miniature is the base, and I do most of the base here with wet blending. So what I do here is I've got two colours. I've got blood red and medium sand here, and I mix them up on the palette. I add a little bit of water to each, and what I do is I try and put the darker colour towards the centre here, and then work out with the medium sand. So while it's all wet, I add the darker colour in the middle, and then I'm working my way out with the medium sand. Now, what I've done here is once it has dried, I added a bit more. I sort of built up a mix of the blood red and the medium sand, and then I just kept adding more and more medium sand to this mix, and I thinned it down quite a lot. It's quite watery here, and it's almost like dry brushing, but with wet paint and a wet brush. I'm just dabbing on the slightly raised areas on the base, because it's quite flat anyway, and I wanted this to be like an orangey sand colour, like you would see in sort of parts of Africa.